Hi everyone, this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 7 in your textbook. Please read Chapter 7, there's lots of information I don't have time to discuss. Okay, let's look at induction fallacies. You're already familiar with the basic principles of inductive reasoning. It uses evidence to support and raise the probability that the conclusion is true. However, when fallacies of induction are committed, it's because the evidence being put forth fails to do that. We will be looking at fallacies of generalization, which are general statements supported by inadequate reasoning, weak analogy, which are fallacies based on debatable or unimportant similarities, mistaken appeal to authority, evidence from a somehow non-authoritative source, mistaken appeal to popularity, which uses public or popular opinion as evidence, cause and effect fallacies that are mistaken reasoning involving two different variables, slippery slope fallacies that rest on an unsupported contention that something will progress to an undesirable outcome, and untested explanation that makes a claim that cannot be tested even in principle. First, fallacies of generalization. To put it simply, these fallacies don't use enough of the right kind of evidence to support the conclusion they're trying to support. We make general claims every day. Some of these claims are based on lots of evidence and examples, but too many of them are based on weak, feeble, or too few examples. So let's look at some of these different fallacies. In hasty generalization, this fallacy occurs because we're using too few examples to come to a general conclusion. We make a sweeping declaration about the entire population of something based only on a few, and sometimes even only one, example. This first argument, the food in this town is lousy judging from this meal. One meal in one restaurant can't even begin to support that contention. It's not even evidence that all the food in that particular restaurant is lousy. It's only evidence that that particular meal was lousy. The second one, like everybody in New York is friendly. Everybody I met was as nice as can be. Well, that's a very nice thing to say, but in a city as big as New York, the sample of New Yorkers you ran into was probably minuscule, certainly too small to come to the conclusion that everyone in New York is friendly. All you can say is that the people you met were friendly. Extrapolating that to the entire population is hasty generalization. And finally, man, old folks around here are terrible drivers. Did you see that old coot passing me on the right? So one old coot passing you on the right does not support your contention that old people around here are terrible drivers. All it means is that this particular old coot is a terrible driver in this particular instance. An anecdote is a short account of a particular incident or event. In arguments, they are often brought up to support general claims. Unfortunately, they're often the only piece of evidence presented to support the conclusion, and again, one example is simply not enough. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Did you read where John Travolta flew his plane into LAX and parked it on the tarmac? Right out there in everyone's way? That's the trouble with these Hollywood actors. They don't care about anyone but themselves. This person is generalizing about these Hollywood actors by providing only one example. The next one. This global warming stuff, what a crock. We had the coldest January on record right here in Columbus last year. Saying global warming can't be true because we had a cold January is also extrapolating from a small sample to a general conclusion. Generally speaking, too small of a sample of a population is simply not enough to come to a conclusion. This example, this Chihuahua bites, therefore all Chihuahuas bite. Just because one dog bites doesn't mean they all do. However, there is one instance in which using a small sample would be okay. That's when the sample is taken from a homogeneous population in which everything in that population is pretty much the same. Here's an obvious example. This sip of coffee is delicious. Therefore, all sips of coffee from this cup will be delicious. Now, notice I didn't say that if this sip of coffee is delicious, then all coffee is delicious. I'm talking about the sips of coffee from this cup, because pretty much all the sips of coffee in this cup are going to taste the same. You can take one sip of coffee and determine the quality of the entire cup. Generalizing from exceptional cases occurs when the arguer attempts to support a general conclusion by citing an unusual or atypical example that's not representative of the population. There are two types of this fallacy: fallacy of biased sample and self-selection fallacy. The fallacy of biased sample generalizes about the larger population, but uses an example that is somehow biased, skewed, or otherwise atypical. In this example, this advertisement for a weight loss product tells us about a woman who lost 75 pounds by using it. This looks like something all overweight people should try. Saying that because the woman in the advertisement lost 75 pounds by using this product is obviously not enough to come to the conclusion that all overweight people should try it. Advertisers of products like this are notorious for focusing on an atypical example that appeals to the needs and emotions of, in this case, overweight people. But this example is certainly not typical. The self-selection fallacy occurs when the sample used as evidence is wholly comprised of members who are in the sample by their own choice. As in this example, most Americans have a favorable view of the president as a person, judging from an online survey conducted by Fox News. So, an online survey where anyone watching Fox News could chime in with their opinion is not particularly scientific and very likely reflects the opinion of Fox News viewers, so saying that most Americans feel this way is simply not representing Americans as a whole. Sometimes people assume that something that is the case generally should always apply, no matter the circumstances, but sometimes specific cases may be exceptions to the general rule, as in this one. It's illegal to drive while talking on a cell phone, so the police officer I saw doing that should be fired. What applies to the general population regarding cell phone usage while driving doesn't necessarily apply to a cop. They get to do things on the job that are illegal for the rest of us, including possibly talking on a cell phone, exceeding the speed limit, and running red lights as necessary to do their job, and they don't get fired for that. So make sure when a general rule is being applied that it's not being applied to an exceptional case. Otherwise, the argument doesn't stand. Analogical reasoning is one of the hallmarks of inductive reasoning. However, as we learned, when you compare two things in order to conclude that what is true in one case is also true in the other case, you need to make sure the things being compared are actually similar in the way that's relevant to the conclusion you're trying to draw. Lots of things have something in common, but unless those commonalities are relevant to the point you're trying to make, the argument is a fallacy. Here are a few examples. The first one: we need a businessman to run the country. After all, the government should be run like a business. When it comes right down to it, the government is not enough like a business to say that someone familiar with running a business is by default capable of effectively running a country. There are simply too many differences between the two things, and it's simply not a good comparison. Is it possible? I suppose. Is it likely? The jury's still out. The second one: people who can't live without their morning coffee are no better than alcoholics. While it's certainly true that many people are addicted to caffeine, the differences between the effects of caffeine and the effects of alcohol make this argument very weak. Finally, one of my favorite fallacies: guns are like hammers. They're made of metal and can be used to kill someone. Yet regulating the sale of hammers would be ridiculous. Regulating gun sales is equally ridiculous. I see similar arguments on Facebook all the time. This argument uses the things that guns and hammers have in common as evidence, but frankly, these two things are not similar enough to come to the conclusion that gun sales shouldn't be regulated. Sure, you can take a hammer and bash someone over the head with it, but that's not its main purpose, which is to build, not to destroy. A gun's main purpose, on the other hand, is to put a hole in something or someone and pretty much take it out of commission. Those are two entirely different purposes, so the conclusion is simply not supported, and this argument is fallacious. A logically valid argument from authority grounds its claim in the beliefs of one or more authoritative sources whose opinions are likely to be true on the relevant issue. However, A mistaken appeal to authority uses evidence from a source that is not authoritative. In other words, the source is simply not qualified to speak to the topic at hand. Sources could be non-authoritative because of their personal bias, their disagreement with the consensus on the issue, or their non-expertise in the relevant issue or any number of other issues. Here are a few examples. The first one, my best friend who watches a lot of YouTube videos is convinced that the Illuminati are actually in charge of what happens in the world. I think he might be onto something. So your friend, whose expertise on the topic of who's really in charge is that he watches a lot of YouTube videos, is not really a credible or authoritative source for coming to the conclusion that the Illuminati are running things, no matter how passionately he believes it. He simply lacks the expertise, and he's using his own sources that may or may not be credible either to come to the conclusions and then trying to convince you. The second example, Dr. Oz said that a product using green coffee beans promoted weight loss. I'm going to order some. While Dr. Oz is a popular television show host and a successful cardiothoracic surgeon, he has an unfortunate way of taking that credibility and applying it to topics in which he's not an expert, like weight loss. In this particular instance, he was actually told to stop touting this particular product, which he was selling on his program. His defense was that he was simply providing different points of view about this and other questionable health issues like GMOs and vaccinations. The bottom line here is that just because someone has credibility on one topic, that doesn't mean they have expertise on another topic. Be careful when looking at claims made by people who are experts on one topic, but not on the one they are addressing. Mistaken appeal to popularity occurs when someone just uses the evidence that most people think something is the case to prove that it is indeed the case. You'll hear things like, everyone knows, or some people know, or most people think that something's true. Well, guess what? Sometimes people think things that have no basis in fact. There are lots of quote-unquote facts that are floating around out there that are just assumed to be the case, and people use them to support arguments all the time. The form, X is true because most people think so, is so common that when we hear things like that, we have a tendency to just accept them because, hey, if most people think something, can they be wrong? Well, yes, it's certainly possible for many people to be wrong about something. Here's one I see all the time. Now, no matter how you feel about Hillary, this blanket statement is often used in political arguments as if it were absolutely the case. Of course she's a crook, everyone knows that. Well, many different government investigations over the years have come to the conclusion that she really hasn't done anything that could be considered criminal. There's also a lot of contention, mostly by her political opponents, that those investigations were somehow tainted and that the real story is sinister and the government's conclusions can't be trusted. So if there are these two very different conclusions, why do we just assume that we know she's got to have done something evil? Because that idea keeps getting repeated over and over until we've heard it so much that it has become a quote-unquote fact. But just because it's out there as being true doesn't necessarily make it true. Just because lots of people think something doesn't make it true. There are a couple of different flavors of the appeal to popularity, the appeal to common practice, and the bandwagon fallacy. The appeal to common practice, also called the appeal to tradition, sounds pretty good on the face of it. Lots of things that we do are based in tradition and common practice. They've worked for a long time, and as they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. However, not everything based in tradition is necessarily a good thing. For instance, for centuries Americans traditionally owned slaves, and it's not an uncommon practice in some other countries even today. Does that justify it? Is it okay to treat people horribly like that just because it's something that is or was commonly done? So this argument, traditionally marriage has been restricted to heterosexual couples. Therefore, it's right to restrict marriage to heterosexual couples. It's fallacious as it's based entirely on the fallacy of appeal to tradition. If you're going to argue something like this, you'd better come up with something better than that's the way it's always been. As humans, we have a very strong need to belong. The bandwagon fallacy plays on this psychological tendency as evidence that you should or shouldn't do something because the group with whom you want to be associated does or doesn't do that thing. Mothers know this as the teenager fallacy, and when their kid insists on doing something because all their friends are doing it, they typically respond by saying, "Well, if all your friends jumped off a cliff, would you do it too?" And when you're 15, the answer is probably yes. But as adults, we can still fall into this fallacy. Here's some examples. You shouldn't shop at Walmart. None of us ever goes there. The evidence to support the conclusion that you shouldn't shop at Walmart is that none of us do, which really isn't evidence. And the second one, I need some of those fabulous shoes. I've seen so many women wearing them. If you identify with that particular group of women, then you might believe that what they wear is evidence that you should wear it too. But that's psychological, not logical, and therefore a fallacy. In the chapters on inductive argument, we talked about causal reasoning and how difficult it is to link things that might have something in common into a specific cause-effect relationship. Because it is so difficult, it's often easy to commit the two major types of cause and effect fallacies listed here. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after this, therefore because of this, and cum hoc ergo propter hoc, which means with this, therefore because of this. They both use time, or when two things happen, as the factor that links two events together. But timing is not necessarily a reason to link things together. The post hoc fallacy occurs when the arguer assumes that the fact that one event came after another event means that the one was necessarily caused by the other. As we've learned before, correlation does not prove causation. Here's an example. A black cat ran out in front of me when I was walking down the sidewalk, and a few minutes later I tripped over the curb and broke my foot. So obviously there's something to that superstition about black cats. Lots of superstitions are based on this fallacy. However, there's no logical connection between a black cat crossing your path and then breaking your foot a few minutes later. Just because those two things happen consecutively does not mean they are in any way connected. Now, if you tripped over the cat and broke your foot, then you could make that connection between the two events, but that still doesn't prove the superstition to be true. The next example, after I took Zicam, my cold went away fast. Therefore, taking Zicam caused my cold to go away fast. Well, it's entirely possible other variables were present that caused your cold to go away. There are a couple of varieties of this fallacy. In the first one, you may be overlooking the possibility of coincidence. We have an innate need to make sense of the world, but sometimes things just happen sequentially for no reason at all. So in this example, after Susan threw out the chain letter, she was fired. Therefore, throwing out the chain letter caused her to get fired. There's absolutely no connection between these two events, except that they happen coincidentally to occur in this order. Overlooking a possible common cause. I left the lights on when I went to bed. Next morning I woke up with a headache. Therefore, sleeping with the lights on caused a headache. Did leaving the lights on actually cause the headache, or did this person leave the lights on and wake up with a headache for some other reason, such as going to bed unusually tired or late or maybe even intoxicated? So you might think that one thing caused the other, when instead both of those things happened because of some other cause. Overlooking the possibility of random variation. In our test, we asked randomly selected men to drive a golf ball as far as they could. We then had them wear our magnetic bracelet and try again. On the second occasion, the men hit the ball an average of 10 feet further. Our bracelet can lengthen your drive as well. This person is saying that wearing a magnetic bracelet causes men to hit a golf ball further than it would if they weren't wearing it. When we looked at how scientists test for cause-effect in Chapter 11, we learned that one of the things they have to do is account for things that could affect variables. It's entirely possible that random variation accounted for these results. Finally, overlooking the possibility of regression. There's something called regression to the mean in statistical analysis, which is a phenomenon that states that if a variable has a certain measurement that is atypical, either very high or very low, on its first measurement, that it will likely be less atypical and more normal upon the second measurement, and vice versa. So in this case, after a terrible evening with mosquitoes, you wear a copper Mosquito Be Gone bracelet. The mosquitoes didn't seem so bad after that. You conclude that the bracelet works. So in this case, the first evening there could have just been a lot more mosquitoes out there, and the second evening it wasn't so bad with a more normal number of mosquitoes, and the copper bracelet may not have had anything to do with it at all. The Coomhock fallacy is very similar, but the fallacy here is that two simultaneous events are not necessarily connected causality. For instance, in this example, we were all praying for John while he was in surgery. The surgery was successful, so we know that our prayers were answered. While many people believe in prayer, there is so far little to no scientific evidence to support the contention that praying for someone undergoing surgery is in any way connected to its success. This is not to say that one had no effect on the other, but it's simply not enough evidence to establish that these things happen simultaneously. Therefore, they're causally connected. You can believe whatever you want, but logically, this is a fallacy. Just like in post hoc, Coomhock fallacies come in different varieties. Here are a couple of them. Overlooking the possibility of coincidence. I got cancer when I lived under a high-voltage power line. Therefore, the high-voltage power line caused my cancer. Now, lots of studies have been done to try to find a link between power lines and cancer, and to this point, those studies have not necessarily found any solid evidence that links those two things together, although the jury is still out. In the meantime, there are other factors that are known to cause cancer, like smoking, sun exposure, and genetics. It might be completely coincidental that you got cancer when you were living close to power lines, and it was due to one of those other factors. Overlooking a possible common cause. Here's one. Chimney fires and long underwear purchases increase in frequency at the very same time. Therefore, chimney fires cause people to buy long underwear. Well, that's obviously silly, but it does point out that just because two things happen simultaneously, one doesn't cause the other to happen. They both happen for the same reason, because it's winter. People buy more long underwear in the winter, and chimney fires are more likely in the winter because your fireplace is being used more often. And overlooking the possibility of reverse causation. Here's an example. Successful business people often drive expensive cars, so if I get a nice car, I'll be more successful. Does buying a nice car make you more successful? I know people who think so and spend far more money than they should on something they think will make them look successful and therefore be successful. But frankly, it's the other way around. A successful person is more likely to have the money to spend on a nice car. The car is not the cause of success, but the result of it. We looked at anecdotes as evidence earlier in the lecture when we were discussing hasty generalization. Sometimes it's also of the causal variety, in which someone tries to support or disprove a claim about cause and effect by using a story or example. Here's what I mean. I've heard doctors say eating red meat daily increases your risk of heart disease, but I don't believe it. My uncle was a rancher and he lived to be 100. His entire life he ate red meat 3 times a day. He didn't die of a heart attack either. He died when he fell down a well. Well, good for your uncle for dying of falling down a well rather than from a heart attack, I guess. But one atypical example like this does not support the claim that eating red meat does not increase your risk of heart disease. Slippery slope fallacies occur when someone contends that some action or event will ultimately result in an undesirable or negative outcome. It's basically a warning that if one thing happens, it will cause a slippery slope of events that will inevitably lead to this dire conclusion. It's a kind of scare tactic that attempts to get someone to oppose the supposed cause. In this example, if we legalize pot, the next thing you know we'll be making meth legal, then heroin. It will never end. The arguer says that legalizing pot will lead to the eventual legalization of all drugs, so we should oppose the legalization of pot. There's no evidence presented here, just a warning. The second one, no, I don't think we should tip servers 20%. The next thing you know, we'll be tipping them 25%, then 30%, then who knows what. We'll be giving out our entire paycheck every time we eat out. This person wants us to think that tipping 20% is just the start, that we'll end up giving our entire paycheck to the waitress. That's pretty silly, but you get the picture. Finally, untestable explanation fallacy occurs when someone puts forth as evidence something that's either vague or circular or simply cannot be shown in any way to be true, even in principle. Here are a couple of examples. The attack on the Twin Towers was God's way of telling us we're sinners. Well, since the concept of God isn't provable, at least not in any way that we can verify, then there's no way to prove or disprove this statement. It's simply an untestable opinion. The second one, what brought Todd and Brenda together? Fate. Well, what's fate, and how do you know? Other factors, including common interests, a common workplace, or friends in common, or maybe just coincidence, are far more likely to be the case here. But anyway, fate can't be tested. And finally, this vague claim, men are biologically weaker than women, and that's why they don't live as long. First of all, what does biologically weaker mean? Is that something you can formulate a hypothesis about and test it scientifically? You'd have to be way more specific than that. This statement is so vague that it's undefinable. This is the end of the lecture on Chapter 7.